what I want to open with is a reading about the Living Theater, which I grew up in, for those of you who don't know. And I want to take a particular story about the 14th Street Theater and read that, because it's in my mother, Judith Molina's diaries. It's been in several of Julian's interviews, and it's been written about in every book that tells the Living Theater history, has this story in it. But I get to tell it from the point of view of a 14-year-old. The beginning of the story is that Julian and Judith opened a theater on the corner of 14th Street and 6th Avenue, and it became a center for the bohemian and creative arts of that period. Merce Cunningham had his dance studio on the upper floor. John Cage did several of the scores for the plays. Lots of actors whom you've heard about and seen again and again had their first roles or swept the backstage there. Al Pacino, Martin Sheen, James Earl Jones, others came in there and cut their teeth on live performances. Some of them stayed with creative theater all their lives. Others, Eileen Fulton, said, enough of this, I gotta get a job in television, I gotta make some money in my life. And she left the Living Theater's production to go on to play in, was it As the World Turns, for 55 years. She went from the young Angénie, who was so delicate, to the reigning queen bitch of all-time television. And so they built this theater, and we had a spectacular opening night party, and that's all written about in the book. And over the next 4 years, all these incredibly creative things happened on 14th Street and 6th Avenue. And then, remember that part? And then what happened? Let me open the book and see if it tells us. This chapter is called The Siege of the Brig. 4.5 years later, in 1963, I was returning from school, where, as usual, book bag in hand, to the 14th Street Theater, where, unlike usual, crowds have filled the street and police cars line the curb. What is going on? Actors and actresses lean and wave from the windows. Stage ropes and pulleys haul baskets of groceries up to their waiting hands, which guide them into the windows. Police bullhorns are ordering the crowds to disperse. Protesters are walking in lines on the sidewalk, apparently in support of the people inside the building. I approach the front door of the theater. An officer stops me. Theater's closed. You can't go in there. I'm supposed to go in, I tell him. No one can go in. The theater's been shut. Well, I have to do my homework, and my parents are in there, and that's where I go after school. He shakes his head and directs me to talk to the commanding officer. The man in charge is sitting in his patrol car looking very unhappy. What's up, he asks. I repeat my story, and he repeats his foot cop's story. So I go round to the front of his car and start unloading my school books and open my ring binder notebook on the hood of the car. You can see I'm already in trouble. He gets out and comes around too. What are you doing? He asks, his head cocked sideways. I tell him, I'm doing my homework. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. If I don't do it, I'll get in trouble. Big trouble. I can't do it on somebody else's car. People from the protest lines in the street are coming over. Some of them recognize me. You know this kid? The cop in charge asks them. Yeah, his parents are inside the theater, they tell him. It's okay, I tell him. I can do my homework right here. The math book is opening. Pencil and paper are spreading out on the hood of the commander's car. I'm only here until 8 this evening, then I go back home uptown. You'll be here until then? The officers talk and decide to let me in the building. Up the stairs I go, entering the besieged Living Theater from the sea of rush hour 14th Street. What's happened is this. For years, the theater company had been trying to get its not-for-profit tax status. And although they'd filed and refiled the reports and lived up to the proper conditions, The status had been repeatedly put off. The theater had been in court with the tax authorities over this. The proper status was being denied because of the theater's political and socially outspoken productions. In the end, years later, the Living Theater's case was won. And the court ordered the government to pay them $1, exactly $1 in damages. Julian and Judith did not want to sue for money damages. They said, that's just money that's coming out of the taxes that's got to go to somebody else. We're not here to make money, we just want our rights to be affirmed. The ongoing Living Theater production was Ken Brown's The Brig, an astonishing play that detailed a single day in the life of a U.S. serviceman serving time in a United States Marine Corps jail. This, coming on the edge of Soviet protest writer Solzhenitsyn's enormously popular novel, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, painted a reverse picture of the Cold War ideology, where our military prisons, might as well be run by the bad guys. Also, recently, the Living Theater was, as ever, planning another desperate fundraiser to keep the theater alive out of the jaws of closure. Keep those marquee lights burning on 14th Street. The theater's press releases for the fundraiser claim that it will shut its doors if such and such much isn't raised by such a date. Well, this was the excuse the IRS used to come over and seize the building, that the business was about to shut down, and therefore the IRS had to seize the property because of the theater ticket taxes that they were in court over. So the IRS guys show up and announce that if the money for the taxes isn't immediately forthcoming, they will seize the property, and they do. What does that mean, seize the property? You can't just pick up a building and put it in a wheelbarrow and roll it away. No, the IRS guys have to put tags on everything and put seals, big stick-on labels, across all the doors. But first they have to order everyone out of the building. A lot of the acting company and stage technicians were inside working on the theater. A lot of them had been part of the freedom rides into the Deep South over the past 2 years, and participants in the nonviolent protests and sit-ins. And they just sat in, right there in front of the guys from the IRS. Well, the IRS went and got the New York City police, who politely and wisely, I believe, told them that since the building had already been seized, it was now federal, not city property. And the city cops' jurisdiction ended right there at the front door. They'd need federal marshals to haul these people out of there. And because they were going limp, refusing to walk out on their own, they'd need a lot of marshals. And besides, it was Friday evening now, and it would take at least until Monday for the Fed cops to pull the operation together. So the people inside the theater were leaning out the windows, sending down pulleys and hooks and ropes and receiving baskets of food and supplies to hold out through the days ahead. The IRSies had finished stickering doors and tagging objects, and like guys on the clock, had gone home for the day. Most of the people inside the theater were up on the middle floor. That's where the best opening windows were, in the main office and gallery room. Already some of the theater members who weren't inside the building when it was seized had snuck into the theater from over the adjacent unseen roof. More were on their way. I strode up the stairwell with its amalgam of pressed gold leaf and brilliant Crayola crayon as decor on the walls. A collaborative effort by my father Julian and the extraordinary artist Ray Johnson. And past the entrance to the big lobby, rounded the corner by the backstage door, up the next flight of stairs, and emerged in the big green room by the dressing rooms. Sunlight was streaming in from the broad, opened 6th Avenue windows. Julian, Judith, and most of the cast were in the big office. Activity equal to theater in its most full-tilt preparation for production swirled about me. Phones rang. In came baskets of fruit. Tools were being brought to the roof to rig ropes. I was a surprise. Gary! That's what they called me as a youngster. How how did you get inside? Several voices asked, startled to see me. My parents looked up, big smiles at seeing me, and I tell them my tale. Jenny Hecht, one of the company actresses and daughter of the famed screenwriter Ben Hecht, always animated with her golden frizzy hair bouncing, puts her arm over my shoulder and with a theatric sweep of her hand before us announces in her high-pitched voice, "Welcome to the Siege of the Brig." There was, as there often is in standoff situations, an exuberance at first, simply because the status is a standoff and not a loss already. I experienced the same upbeat quality many times again. In 1967 at the occupied Student Center at MIT during the students' protection of an AWOL Vietnam soldier. At the Buffalo Party convention in 1971 in Washington State, where 20,000 acid rock Buffalo Party conventioneers were shut down, besieged by the Washington State Police. Later that same year at the protesters' seizure of the Canadian Indian Center outside Winnipeg. And in 1972, the first rainbow gathering high up in the Rocky Mountains by Strawberry Lake, Colorado. But here, on the corner of 14th Street, in this busiest of cities, this was for me the very first of these hole-ups. Peaceful outlaws on the inside and out-of-whack government on the outside. Press was being notified. Crowds of supporters were demonstrating in long circular lines of marchers along the sidewalks. Set painters were poster painting signs which were lowered out the windows to the marchers. Help save the living theater. Shut the IRS, not the ARTS. No taxes for the war. I went and sat around the green room chairs. Books sprawled open, doing my French, my math, my history. Nighttime settled. People ate. The demonstration on the street quieted down a bit, and inside the cast and crew began preparing to sleep in for the night. Toward the late of the evening, it was usual for me to head uptown and bed down at home. Julian spoke to me in the big neon-lit theater office. On his desk before him were a couple of small piles of papers, a few postcards and some letters. Here, put these in your book bag. Just slip them into the book pages. I looked at the papers, some poems by poets, a letter from Tennessee Williams, a postcard from E.E. Cummings. Judith looked on from over my shoulder. I leafed through the pieces they had gathered. "These are treasures," said Julian, "a few treasures they wanted to preserve from falling into the hands of the IRS. Not money, or valuable tools, or business records. No, these were little ink marks on paper, little typewritten letters on bond and onion skin. Just that. But they were writ by the hand of art, that same hand that through the ages has sculpted, played the lute, painted and poeted and performed, the hand which has through beauty and truth shown humanity to humanity." I put the pages delicately into my math book, ma grammaire française, my history notes. "They won't know what they're looking at, even if they do check my bag," says I. Getting out was easy. A policeman was stationed at the door. I opened it from inside and simply told him I was going uptown because I was going to stay at my grandmother's, and I was out on the street. It always feels, in these situations, that the boundary between the two parts, where the people are being kept out or kept in, is a very strong spiritual place. Maybe because when we transit, go across from one to the other, the difference is so clear. The difference between one way of the world and another way of the world is so strong, with only an imaginary line enforced by armed might between the two. So the differences are made clear to our eyes, differences which are usually hidden in the everyday stuff of our getting about, so that we don't usually see how close we are to the inside of the prison walls, or also how close we are to real freedom. By the next morning, there was a plan in motion. That evening, the theater would perform the Brig within the besieged building, and those lucky enough or daring enough or whatever enough to get themselves inside would get to be the audience. Now the siege itself had its own drama. The plot, within the plot, of course, not all the actors were in the building yet. Still, the play was the Brig, and all the actors had drilled in precision training for months as practice for the mindset of the play. During any at-rest moment during the play or rehearsals, they had been required to stand at attention and read the United States Marine Corps Field Manual. Yes, this acting crew had some preparation for scaling walls, entering through basement ducts, and wiggling in Marine-style crawl over the rooftops. Soon the city police mounted extra forces along the adjacent roof at the back and sides of the building. The long-standing friendship with our neighbor, the pet store owner, led to a number of audience members entering his premises and gaining access up through his back ceiling and into the stairway to the top floor of the dance studio. The IRS had Con Edison shut the power to the building to try to prevent the show, but the theater techies rigged up another power line, and by the time the lights came back on, our audience had more than doubled. The play was played. But eventually, the federal marshals came in great numbers. I think about 50 of them. When the company saw them arriving, they went downstairs from the offices and dressing rooms and went on to the set of the Brig. This stage set was surrounded by a prison yard fence, which in turn surrounded a prison compound, which contained among its facilities an inner lockup, a solitary cell. Each of these levels was constructed of real metal fencing and real locks and real bars. So the actors went down to the theater and locked themselves inside the yard. Then they locked themselves inside the compound. And finally, they locked themselves inside the solitary cell. When the marshals burst in, first they went upstairs to the office where all the activity had been visible from the street. But no one was there. Finally, of course, they found everyone. Where else? In the theater. They had to break into the locked fenced area, then break the locks into the prison compound, and finally into the cell within, in order to remove these people, carry them out from the prison of the theater, down the stairs, into the waiting police wagons below, and then drive them through the city streets to other buildings, where they were brought first inside one locked gate, then another, and finally inside real prison cells in our real world.